And the lady just asked me, why you change your subject from physical chemistry to history of science, and then you change your subject from history of science to archaeology. Why? So, and I just trying to say, I'm just followed Joseph Needham, right? This follows my interest, because I find this is more interesting to me. You know, in my class, we have 30 students in my university. I have 30 classmates. I'm the only one change the subject. So I just find, I read the Joseph Needham's book. I'm serious in it. I read his book because I become interested in history of science. So Joseph Needham is responsible for my transformation, right? So, and I become interested, and I still remember, and when I began to study this subject, history of science, I went to the Institute of Archaeology in Beijing, and I visited an old scholar, and I went into his office. His office is so dark and full of dust, right? It's just like, this is the tomb, right? It's so old, you know, and also has a very strange smell, you know. And I tried to visit this scholar. The scholar is not there, but his daughter is sitting there, and it's the same age as me. I talked to her and said, why your father doing the archaeology? Look at here. It's so boring. Look at all these pottery, right? He's trying to pottery types. And I said, did your father really like this subject? What she said is, when you work on this subject for long enough, you will like it and become love your subject. And I think, I don't know whether I answer your question. I'm just trying to say, you know, every change is just makes sense for me, and I find it interesting, and also the challenge, and also I broaden my research field, and I like my research, and also I'm really grateful for my sponsor, and gave me a chance to study in Cambridge. That's it. And in Cambridge, Cambridge is so beautiful. That's the reason I want to stay.
Actually, explain a little bit. It's a naughty question, because actually, I'm very convinced that we should know more about Joseph. So it's actually, hopefully, through your mouth and words, that for students who aren't able to come today, will be able to benefit from our wisdom and research. I mean, for me personally, I think I should say that everything has its roots. A person, a culture, a nation, the world, and even a subject, a discipline, an intellectual discipline itself. So, irrespective of whether we are students of history, we need to have a historical perspective. That's point number one. And point number two is, I mean, from a very inspiring lecture just now, a phrase came to mind. When there's a will, there's a way. Because Joseph Needham started learning Chinese when he was in his late 30s, and he mastered it. Okay, and you talked about sort of also show pictures about how in ancient China they made patong. So if we apply our mind to it, we could overcome more adversity. And I think this is a value which I hope our young people can embrace after watching your videos, after watching your lecture on YouTube or other forms, or even better, they will be motivated to attend the lecture next year.
The whole question that is asked is, why do we want to know more about the contributions of China, the Chinese nation, Chinese people, Chinese culture to Western civilization? That was the question that Needham wanted to ask and tried to answer. Now, to very many of us Chinese, we have come to a stage of history where we are sometimes ashamed of being Chinese because of what's happening around us. And for very many of us, when we grew up, we were brought up under a very Western culture. I was brought up in Malaysia, you were brought up in Hong Kong, and the British government both ruled Malaya and Hong Kong. And one of the process was that we were never taught much about our Chinese culture. And if we were ever taught about it, we've always thought about what happened in the past that has nothing to do with the present. But Joseph Needham was trying to say there is, and that there was science in China, and there's still science in China. The question is this: when Western civilization developed on the basis of Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's physics, all right, science went on an empirical road. In other words, it went on to quantify what was around us. But in Chinese civilization, when we looked at science, we did not quantify, but we looked at the quality. If you look at Chinese medicine, all right, we do not talk about elements, chemicals, compounds, quantification of chemistry. But if we look at Chinese medicine, we always look at it on the basis of elementary forces, the yin and the yang, and the 5 elements, of how the combination of the 5 elements resulted in a balance of the yin and yang, and therefore the condition of your body, and therefore your health. So Needham was trying to ask one very basic question. How do we come to synthesize or synergize 2 very different science systems? One, Western science that quantifies, Chinese science which qualifies. Now the answer that he tried to give us is perhaps what we should do is to relook at our philosophy. Now let me use one final example to talk about this relooking that Needham tried to do, which someone who then occupied his rooms and office at Gonville and Keys, which I was a student of, Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking actually, when he was a fellow at Gonville and Keys, used Needham's office. Now, we always think that when you look at Western science, you only talk about numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, quantification, right? And what if you read Stephen Hawking's book, The Brief History of Time, you find that for him, science began with mathematics, and then physics, and then as you read The Brief History of Time, it moved to philosophy, because the language of mathematics and the language of science was inadequate to try to say what he wanted to say. And then in the end, he moved on to mythology, precisely because the language of philosophy was inadequate to express what he wanted to say. And so he moved on to a mythological language. Now, what does this tell us? This tells us that science is not merely empirical. All right? Now, if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, he moved in 2 directions. In his physics, he both talked about metaphysics and the empirical sciences. And of course, with the West, it went on to, it tangent off to the empirical. But Aristotle was also trying to tell us that there is an aspect of science, right, that does not need to quantify things, but merely to qualify. And he moved on to metaphysics to describe the cosmology that he wanted to explain. But in the end, what we need to do, or what Needham is trying to tell us, is that we need not split science the way we are splitting it now. What we need to do, and this is what Hong Kong University is trying to do, following the Needham inspiration in curing cancer,